three big things are happening right now. One is because of decades of us dumping a ton of planet warming gases into the atmosphere, the planet's warming up. And everything that was predicted 30 years ago is happening today. Thing two that's happening is that the world is slowly decarbonizing. And this is the good news story that you don't hear on the news. Solar and wind were way more expensive than coal and natural gas. Today, if you want to deploy a megawatt of power, it's going to be a megawatt of solar or wind because they're cheaper than the alternative, and the market knows what to do with that. And so the third thing that's happening is the world is decarbonizing, but it's not decarbonizing fast enough. The verb that we obsess over at Watershed is accelerate the climate economy.
Welcome to Inspired. I'm Alex Von Tobel. What if climate action wasn't just good for the planet, but actually really good for business? Taylor Francis is the founder and CEO of Watershed, the leading enterprise sustainability platform that is now valued at $1.8 billion. Watershed helps some of the world's biggest companies, FedEx, Walmart, Airbnb, measure, report, and reduce their carbon emissions. Collectively, their customers are responsible for 5% of global carbon emissions, which goes to show the massive and meaningful impact Watershed has. My husband, Cliff Ryan, invested in Watershed Series B back in 2022 and has always been impressed with Taylor. After meeting him, I was too. I'm thrilled to finally have him on. In this conversation, we'll talk about how he built Watershed, why AI is transforming how companies tackle their supply chains, and why he believes we're living through the biggest transformation in climate in 30 years. Let's dive right in. If you're running a startup, we know things like managing equity and communicating with investors are always top of mind. Carta has built a connected suite of tools that over 40,000 companies use to do just that. Their platform of software and services helps you lay the groundwork so you can focus on building. To learn more or get started, visit carta.com. And with that, let's welcome Taylor. Taylor, first of all, I'm so happy to get to spend time with you. I know we've spent some time in person. Thank you so much. And I am so excited to dive into everything that you're building on a topic I obviously care deeply about. I want to go back to the beginning, your origin story. And you grew up in the Bay Area. Your dad worked in venture. How did you think about being around the startup ecosystem, the investing world? How did that shape you? And I always like to just ask the simple question. If we go back to the beginning of you and your 5'10", et cetera, is it an obvious straight line that you ended up right where you are today?
Well, first, Alexa, thanks for having me. This is a total treat, and I'm glad to be here. I was lucky to grow up in California. I think the most important part of my childhood was actually that I grew up in a family that spent a lot of time outside. So, for me, growing up in California was about the fact that for our August summer vacations, we would get in the car, we'd drive through Yosemite, up and over the Sierras to Mammoth, and we'd spend summer break every year doing a backpacking trip in the High Sierra, starting near Mammoth or starting near Bishop or Bridgeport or all these amazing towns on the east side of the Sierra. And we'd spend 8 days as a family out in the woods, carrying everything on our back and catching fish and filtering water and playing card games. And so I think the thing that feels maybe unsurprising to me is to draw a line from a childhood in the outdoors to a career spent thinking about the planet and climate and the environment and conservation and the natural world. And ultimately I think that's the thing that motivated me from an early age.
When you were 12, you saw An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. I remember seeing that movie myself too. And it clearly hit you hard. I think you described it as leaving the theater feeling energized and angry. Say more.
Yeah, it was summer. I saw the movie with my mom. I was 12 or 13 years old. I was pretty pissed off. This was a movie about how the generation before was going to leave my generation with a very different world. And I love to ski. I was thinking about snowpack in California in winter. But beyond that, it just seemed like, we were going to be left with a totally different world. And I found it kind of energizing in the sense of, okay, this feels like it could be a generational cause, a bit of a generational call to arms on we've just barely enough time to try to change that future. And so I went home and I tried to get in touch with Al Gore's office, and it turned out that they were training a couple hundred people to be the first class of this experiment, which was an experiment. Can we train people to give the slideshow that Al Gore presented in the movie at Rotary clubs and schools and libraries and teacher associations and the places where communities actually gather? And I was part of that first cohort. And I ended up spending all of high school going around, mostly speaking at other schools. I figured out if I could kind of do a school assembly, talk to 1,000 students, they'd go home and talk to their parents. That was kind of my theory of change. And so, yeah, that movie was the beginning for me of feeling like climate is this generational call to arms that I want to spend time working on.
I love that. So let's fast forward. You then went to study public and international affairs at Princeton, and later led the entrepreneurship club. So clearly, this is not an accident. Um, at that point, were you thinking that you wanted a future in policy, or was it clear you wanted to go build something? Where was your head then?
Yeah, I went to Princeton because I wanted to study policy and work probably in DC. And that was the obvious path for me on climate problems, seems like a policy problem, figure out a set of policy tools to solve it. Um, Interesting thing that happened when I was in college was Obama had been elected president. We had a Democratic House, we had a Democratic Senate. It seemed like if we were ever going to have climate policy passed in the US, that was going to be the time. Um, and yet the cap and trade bill, which was what the whole environmental movement had invested in, this is the tool to solve climate change, failed amidst Democratic president, Democratic House, Democratic Senate. Um, and so that was, I remember that being kind of a destabilizing fact for me in terms of what is it that I want to do. Um, and it made me think, hey, maybe this whole tech private sector startup thing that I'd kind of been aware of growing up in California, but honestly not been that involved in because my head was so in climate science policy world. Maybe there's something to the agility, the fact you don't need to ask people's permission, the fact that you can just do things and just build things and start things. And so that kind of pivoted me back to California. And I decided I wanted to work at the best tech company I could possibly find. I found Stripe. I thought the people at Stripe were insanely smart and insanely kind and insanely thoughtful. And I decided I want to do anything I could do to work at Stripe. If the only job they'd give me would be sweeping the floors, I would take that job with gusto and then work at Stripe after college.
While you were at Stripe, you learned a lot from Patrick and John, the founders. Um, One of the things I've admired about Stripe a lot from afar is their simplicity. I feel like Stripe gets simplicity right. Um, Share some of your takeaways from being in that company.
Yeah, they were amazing founders. And we were lucky that they invested in Watershed. We're lucky that Stripe is a customer of Watershed. We helped start Stripe's climate program. So there's a ton of amazing um, energy around Stripe's impact on climate and on Watershed. I would say that the biggest thing I learned is that it's actually, in some weird way, easier to solve a hard problem than an easy problem. Stripe was in this space that you could view as building payments software,
Yep.
which is not an easy problem, but that's not a world-changing problem. And instead, Stripe framed their mission as grow the GDP of the internet, build the kind of software layer for bringing the economy online. And that's a big problem. And by kind of expanding the scope of what they're trying to do from build an API for payments to grow the GDP of the internet, in a weird way, it actually makes it easier to accomplish the goal because it's a mission that is big enough and compelling enough that the smartest people, the most tenacious people want to be a part of it. And we thought a lot about that in starting Watershed, in let's be unapologetic about the scope of what we dream of doing. And our version of that was our mission is to accelerate the climate economy, and we want to put a number on it. And that number is we want to help companies reduce or remove 500 million tons of CO2 per year by 2030. And that's actually about 1% of the world's carbon emissions every year by 2030. It's a big, audacious, terrifying goal. And that was the day one idea for Watershed. Before we had a product, before we had a pitch, we had that number because we thought the bigger the goal, actually the easier it's going to be to pull it off.
I love that. Where was the origin of the idea? And what what happened such that you, Taylor, were like, it's time to go? Because you obviously had great people you were working with, a great setup. What made you be like, it's time?
So Christian, Abby, and I all had worked together a bit. We'd actually hiked together a lot, coming back to the outdoors as a bit of a through line.
Love that.
I think the two ideas for us were, one is we wanted to work together, and two, we wanted to work together on climate. And those two things were a lot more important than any notion of starting a company. We never had any discussion on, hey, we want to start a startup. We want to start a. No, it was we wanted to work together and we wanted to work on climate. And the next idea was that 500 megaton goal. Let's work backwards from something that, if it goes right, if everything goes right, it could add up to a magnitude of impact that matters. Um, and we actually, when we kind of sat down in Christian's guest bedroom in fall of 2019, we spent 2 weeks workshopping a different idea every day for what's something we could work on that would add up to 500 megatons of climate impact. And we thought about hardcore science projects, carbon removal. We thought about political campaigns. What's an advocacy investment that we could make that could move the needle on policy? We thought about consumer ideas. Is there some sort of Strava for climate that helps you make the right, personal climate choices? Um, and one of the ideas we workshopped, we called at the time B2B decarbonization. That was the thing on the whiteboard.
The big idea, the perfectly branded idea.
B2B decarb was what the Notion doc said. And there's a bit of a top-down and a bottom-up thought there. The top-down thought was, it's hard to count to 500 megatons of climate impact. And the best way we could figure out how to count to that amount of impact was through companies, right? There are hundreds, thousands of companies that have carbon emissions in their supply chain bigger than most countries. And we could imagine selling software to those companies, and we could imagine those companies making better decisions. So it's like, wow, there's a real path to leverage here. But then the bottom-up idea was that Christian had been a part of starting Stripe's climate program. And that was a volunteer nights and weekends effort to measure Stripe's emissions, figure out what to do about them, ultimately put $1 million into carbon removal to offset the emissions of Stripe. That $1 million eventually, after we left, when much smarter people came in after us, grew to $1 billion in the Frontier market commitment. But through that experience, we thought, okay, the spreadsheets and offsets and consultants approach, 2019 status quo, is definitely not good enough to transform an economy. Let's build the tool we wish existed. And those two ideas together, day 5 of Watershed, B2B Carb, that's all we've been doing ever since.
I love it. Day 5. Day 5. I'm going to get you a t-shirt that says day 5. When we think a little bit about, and now I want you to educate everyone that's listening who is not as informed. If we start with the basics, 2/3 of the Fortune 500 companies have some sort of climate commitment, right? So they've said, we've got to do something. But I think most of them don't know where to start operationally. And you've got scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Just quickly give us a lay of the land, and let's pretend we're a big company, a Fortune 50 company, trying to do right by climate. What happens?
Yeah. So if you're a Fortune 50 company, you've got a complex set of operations, products, suppliers, transportation, customers. And as you said, there's a 2/3 chance you've set a commitment saying we want to reduce those emissions over time in line with what the science tells us is required to solve the climate problem. So how do you go about doing that? The first thing you got to do is figure out, where are your emissions coming from? And indeed, the kind of space has this protocol to think that through. There's kind of 3 categories. One is scope 1, it's the emissions from facilities you own. So your cars, your planes. If you operate a power plant or a chemical plant or a paper mill, gases that are being released directly into the atmosphere from your assets. Scope 2 is the emissions from the electricity consumption that may be happening somewhere else. It may be happening at the power plant on the electricity grid, but it's from the electricity. You're turning the lights on, you're running your factory. And then scope 3 is everything else in your supply chain. So if you're making cars, it's the steel and the plastic and the leather that go into a car. If you're making software, it's the energy that runs the data center that trains the AI model that you're building your business around. If you're a food business, it's what's happening on the field. Is there deforestation? Are there fertilizer? What's happening with your customers when they actually plug your device, your appliance into the wall? So those are the three categories. And um, our philosophy is you want to measure quickly so you can figure out where your leverage is
Yep.
and then focus all of your attention there. And that's different for every company, but ultimately our kind of thesis is you want to get as quickly as possible to thinking about what is the intervention in the world concretely, practically, tactically that you want to have happen. And if you're in the food business, it's probably less deforestation in your supply chain. If you're manufacturing consumer electronics, it's probably clean power at the manufacturer of your suppliers who are making semiconductors. It's generally not that complicated. And so we try to make it easier for companies to figure out, okay, this is the thing that matters, and let's focus our effort there.
Let's talk a little bit about where Watershed comes in and makes reporting, measuring easier. Give us a tangible example of kind of what that looks like. And to just repeat it back, you've got scope 1, 2, and 3, which effectively is all the ways that any company that is existing is
Has impact.
impacting our
Yes.
lived environment and climate.
Yep.
Where does Watershed come in?
Yeah. So think of Watershed as enterprise software and AI for sustainability data.
Got it.
So if you're a company, you've got Workday for bringing sense to your HR domain. You've got Salesforce for bringing sense to your go-to-market domain. You've got Watershed for bringing sense to your sustainability data. And we start by basically plugging into the systems of record of a company and ingesting data that may not be in any system of record. PDFs of utility bills and bills of materials that are not well standardized, those come into Watershed. We've built this kind of data engine that is informed by the latest science about where do emissions come from? What is the emissions of a pound of beef from Brazil? How is that different than the emissions from a different product or input? And then we give companies this kind of BI dashboard for their sustainability data. Once you've got that, companies want to do a couple things with it. The CFO raises their hand and says, we're going to use this to disclose and report, right? 5 years ago, companies were reporting voluntarily. Today, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, UK, EU, California, New York, Mexico, Brazil, dozens and dozens of countries and jurisdictions have this as a regulated disclosure alongside financial results, privacy, security, that sort of thing. So the CFO says, I love that this data is well governed, it's auditable, it's in a system of record, there's no fat-fingered mistakes, it's going to pass audit. It's going to be the basis of how we communicate with investors and customers about this data. The procurement team says we're going to use this to buy greener materials for our products. The product design team says we're going to use this to make sure that when we're designing the next version of our shoe, we're thinking about where does the carbon come from and how can this be a low carbon product. And so it becomes this kind of tool for decision making as companies realize generally that there's a lot they can do that actually improves the business and reduces carbon at the same time.
That's incredible. So it's not just reporting and measuring, it's actually helping companies take action and begin to play offense
Yes.
and to understanding their proactive decisions that can impact the environment. Taylor, I want to talk a little bit about your go to market. By the way, I love the name Watershed. Can I just say that? It's like, it's
Picking
just
a name is so hard. Anyone who's picked a
so
name,
hard.
it's so hard.
It's so hard. I joke all day long that it's like this company and that company and this company, and they all have one tweak. And I'm like, they're all the same name. Watershed is just it's Watershed. Like
Oh, thank
it's
you.
it's goddamn good, Taylor. Nice
Can I
job.
tell can I give the quick story behind that, Alexa?
Yes, please.
We found it so hard to pick a name. So we after we picked this idea, we made a sales deck that was, hey, here's what it is we do, and we went on the road and we talked to 50 customers in the next month. And we got all the way to being a couple days before signing a contract with our first customer. And we were like, we don't have a name. The sales deck didn't have a logo on the first slide. It had the customer's logo on the first slide. And so we killed ourselves for 2 weeks trying to pick a name. And the thing we liked about Watershed is that, again, back to the outdoors, there's actually two ecological meanings of a watershed. One is kind of the connected ecosystem of rivers and trees and meadows that all flow out the same river. And that to us resonated with the idea that companies are connected in ecosystems of what they produce on carbon. And we were going to try to enable a kind of cascade of decarbonization. But then the British definition of a watershed is the ridgeline, where if a water drop falls on one side, it goes out to one river valley. And if it falls on the other, it goes out to another. And that's where you get this phrase of the watershed moment, because that is the turning point of, am I going to be in California or New York by the time I make it to the ocean? And we feel, and like for all the bad news on climate, for all the bad news on climate policy, it does feel like in the last 10 years, we have flipped to the other side of the mountain where the world is going to decarbonize. And it's just a question of how long it's going to take. So anyway, it's
I
tying a
love it.
few outdoorsy threads together around that.
You perfectly teed up my next question, which is, at this point, you have major companies, FedEx, Walmart, Airbnb, Spotify, many global banks. Um, and you're not just helping them individually, but to your point of the watershed, you're actually helping entire ecosystems because there's a network effects to what you're doing. Say more. Help me understand that.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So, the carbon in the economy is very connected across supply chains. And so, what's a good example? If you are producing electronic devices, we work with one of the biggest computer manufacturers in the world. Your emissions are generally coming from the things you're buying from your suppliers. And it's coming from fabs and semiconductors and plastic and aluminum. And um, in order to decarbonize, you actually need to work with your supply chain. Um, and that collaboration is not easy, but it's also where all the magic happens. And so that is our theory of change. Our theory of change is that if this kind of demand signal can come from companies, from regulators, from consumers, it can show up at each stage of a supply chain, and a company making a very concrete decision to switch to clean power, produce a lower carbon material, be more efficient, move a good with an EV truck rather than an internal combustion engine truck. And um, in order for that to happen, there actually needs to be a kind of means of value exchange between those companies.
Yep.
And that's where keeping score on what's the carbon of each trade-off, what's the carbon of each product and decision enables companies to collaborate on that. So we feel like we're the supporting player. We're behind the scenes. We're just trying to enable these massive companies, massive suppliers with huge impact. But that type of collaboration is the thing that we think can change the world.
I love that. And we're going to talk a little bit about where you think the world is heading in a second. But one thing I just quickly wanted to say, so Watershed Series A was notable in that you had two of the more influential investors of the last few decades, Sequoia's Michael Moritz and Kleiner Perkins' John Doerr, co-led the round. Before that in your career, you interned with Sheryl Sandberg. You've had some exceptional people around you, and as you said, you got to work with the Stripe founders. I would love just to get a sense of, having been able to be and learn from some really iconic people. Um, what do you feel like you've absorbed from having that be your boardroom?
Yeah, we've been so lucky on investors. I think two things, maybe three things. One is hard work, man. you know,
Amen.
um, it really, I don't know that there's a lot of, um, well, it's nice to see people at the very top of their game and to realize there's no shortcut. And I feel like Mike Moritz and John Doerr, two of the best investors in history, fastest people to respond to an email, most prepped people at a board meeting. Um, they just put in the work and they put in the hours and they put in the time. And
By the way, Taylor, above that wall is a big joke. It's no shortcuts.
No shortcuts.
There's no shortcuts, and
There's probably smarter people who have found shortcuts. I definitely have not found them, and it's been comforting to me to see people at the top of their game who. So I think that's thing one is just the grind and the hard work is true for people who would have a lot of excuses to spend a lot less time and coast on past. Um, I think about John Doerr, who has shown up to tons of our sales pitch meetings, who's helped send introductions to get the first call, who is at his core a seller to this day. So I think that's one thing. Second thing is, there's definitely a calmness and a long-term orientation that I see in investors who've been a part of some of the greatest companies ever. When we have had our best quarters have been when our investors have said, hey, I think you're not watching the pipeline over here and you're setting yourself up for a tough quarter, 2 quarters down the road. Or how could we be going even faster given we feel the wind at our back? A lot of what made this quarter good was not your execution, it was the environment. We should be, pressing our advantage more than we are. And then we've had bad quarters and the investors have said, hey, you got the important thing right, which is you hired the right people and you made the customers happy. And that's going to turn out in beating your numbers down the road. So I think there's a long-term horizon that is also tied to a calm that I've really observed and learned from them. And then the last thing, which is it's a company value for Watershed that I think I admire in a lot of the people that I've been able to learn from, is this notion of kind of people who excel at the intersection of intensity and care. So intensity is competitiveness, drive, hard work, accountability. It really matters for your self-satisfaction, your view of yourself that you succeed, that you put great work in. Um, but care is kindness and warmth and giving a damn about what's going on in people's lives outside of work. And it's easy to work with people who really spike on one of those. I think it's actually pretty rare to work with people who spike on both. And it's really rare to be a part of a team or an organization that spikes on both. And everyone who's been on our board has been at the intersection of intensity and care. It's one of our operating principles as a company. We tell every person that when they interview for a role so that they can opt out of either the intensity or the care. And
the people who opt out of the car is a real self-selecting group.
no, I think people opt out of both. I think there are people who hear the words kindness and warmth and don't want a workplace that's about that. And there are people who hear the words intensity and say, wow, that doesn't quite sound like what I want to bring to this next role. And that's great. And we end up with a culture of people who've kind of opted in to both halves of that.
I love that on many levels. I feel like I would enjoy being a teammate at Watershed. This feels
If only we could be so lucky, Alexa.
I'm like, there's got to be like an internship or something I could apply for. I want to just take a step back. As I think I care a lot about climate. And what's happening with climate right now? Like, just can you give us your point of view? And I don't even mean politically. I mean just what's happening to the planet that we all, as human beings, stewards of this place, what's happening right now? Can you cut through a lot of the noise?
Yeah.
And I feel like even I'm overwhelmed sometimes by the media of like, what's this and what's just facts. Like, what's happening right now,
Yeah.
Taylor?
I think three big things are happening right now. One is because of decades of us dumping a ton of planet warming gases into the atmosphere, the planet's warming up. And everything that was predicted 30 years ago is happening today. And you see that in weather extremes. I think you see it most acutely. I mean, my view is that the most acute impacts of climate are going to be felt in destabilizing already at-risk communities around the world. We in the US, there's going to be very bad impacts of climate change. I think of wildfires in California. We've got capacity to adapt. The thing that really matters is that there are billions of people who don't have the capacity to adapt, and where crop failure means a really big impact on livelihoods and health and communities. So thing one that's happening is that the planet is warming. exactly as predicted, if not worse, and we are seeing that show up in newspapers and lives and human suffering around the world. Um, Thing two that's happening is that the world is slowly decarbonizing. And this is the good news story that you don't hear on the news.
Yeah, give me a good news story.
In 2006, when I first started presenting the Inconvenient Truth slideshow, solar and wind were way more expensive than coal and natural gas. Today, if you want to deploy a megawatt of power, it's going to be a megawatt of solar or wind because they're cheaper than the alternative, and the market knows what to do with that. That's happened decades faster than the forecast slides we had in the Inconvenient Truth presentation 20 years ago. Last year, clean energy stock index up 30%, oil stock energy index flat. Why is that? It's because we're building a lot of new energy, and it turns out that solar and batteries are the best way to do that. So the world is decarbonizing. You look at the US, economy growing, emissions going down. The UK, economy growing, emissions going down. There's dozens of countries where economies growing, emissions are going down. A lot of that, by the way, is because China, which has been much maligned by the West as a heavy emitter, has become the arsenal of decarbonization. They are the superpower of solar, of batteries, and EVs. And they've made these technologies very cheap, such that people are opting for them purely on the basis of economics. Different question around what that says about the US versus China's strength in the future, but the world is benefiting from a massive build out, especially in China, of clean energy technologies at low price. What that means is that the range of outcomes for climate is now more constrained than it was 20 years ago. Some of the
Yep.
worst case scenarios of 5 and 6 degree warming are extremely unlikely to happen. And we're looking at a kind of range between 2 and 4 degrees. Now, it turns out the difference between 2 and 4 degrees is enormous. Every tenth of a degree, especially for the global south, makes a really big difference. And so the third thing that's happening is the world is decarbonizing, but it's not decarbonizing fast enough. And I think that's because maybe partially inertia, these are complex systems, but also because the industries that are not going to be around 150 years from now are fighting a rear guard effort to remain relevant. And there's a attack on climate policy in the West that is not going to prevent a zero carbon future. It's just trying to slow it down. Um, and so I think those are the three things that are happening right now. The verb that we obsess over at Watershed is accelerate the climate economy. The climate
Yep.
economy is an inevitability. We're just on track to get there a decade or two too late. And so how can we move faster?
First of all, thank you for having some good news. It's nice. It's nice to hear. Um, if we fast forward, you obviously have just been. Thank God for you seeing that movie decades ago. Um, if you fast forward the next decade, what do you see? If you were going to make a prediction, two or three, just things that feel obvious to you, Taylor, um, of where the world is headed. What's in your mind?
I think on climate in particular, couple things. One is the climate AI intersection matters a great deal. I think about that in two dimensions. One is we're building a ton of new energy capacity to power the data center economy. It really matters that that economy be powered by clean power. Because if it is, then this can be a catalyst for building new generation that decarbonizes the grid. If it's not, it's going to extend, it can be backwards progress on decarbonization right at the worst possible moment. So it's really important. And I think it's a mixed picture actually on that. I think that there are some companies that are deeply, deeply committed to renewable energy for data centers, and there are others that aren't. And where the dollars end up falling, I mean, back to our earlier discussion around supply chains and choice across supply chains really matters. Um, the other part of AI and climate is that if we're going to spend all this energy building the superpower, we better point that superpower at solving the climate problem.
Amen.
And there's no shortage of parts of the climate problem that would benefit from acceleration by AI. That, of course, is a huge obsession of ours. We view Watershed as a company trying to harness the best of the AI superpowers for the climate problems that matter as people use data to make decisions. We built a bunch of products in that area. We're going to build a bunch more. We're super excited about what's possible there. Um, so I think that kind of AI climate intersection is one thing that I think is going to be really dominant over the next decade. Um, and then the other I would say is I think you can kind of chart the progression of how does climate interact with business. And it was initially about reputation and brand, and that motivated a lot of the early climate programs. And brand and reputation have value, so that was useful. Um, then it was around policy and compliance and regulation and paperwork, and that also serves a purpose. Um, I think we're now kind of entering this mode of climate as a driver of revenue. And a thing that I'm really obsessed with is, what's the Fortune 500 of climate businesses? If you were to rank the businesses with revenue from their climate products. BCG did research that the kind of green products market is worth $5 trillion today, second
Wow.
only to the technology and AI and data center market. And that includes everything from EVs to batteries to solar panels to people selling green materials and green crops. And we see it across our customer base. But I think that, like, the bigger that number is, the more the kind of forces of capitalism and companies are going to take us to a good place.
Actually, on that note, because for me, this feels adjacent. In September of 2025, you launched the first of its kind AI tool, Product Footprints, um, which combines AI engineering, climate science input from the most complex businesses to solve scope three.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about just the visibility layer that you're getting up, because that's really what you're saying is like right now, people want to make good decisions. No one wants the planet destroyed.
Totally.
You're simply illuminating them
Yes.
and making it clear that climate can be profitable.
Yes. People want to make good decisions. People want to make good decisions if it's good for their business. And the good news is, because of all this technological progress over the last 20 years, there are a lot of good decisions that are good for the business. There's a lot of climate action that's in the money today, but indeed, it's hard to find. And so one of the kind of most enduring unsolved problems in climate is the scope 3 problem. If you've got all these emissions in your supply chain that go into the materials and ingredients that go into your product, but you can't see them, how do you open that black box and take the right action? And the traditional approach on this has been you send surveys to suppliers. And so over the last 10 years, people have been trading surveys back and forth across the Pacific Ocean, and absolutely nothing has happened as a result. Um, and um, we think AI can really change that. And so we built this product, Product Footprints. We launched it in September alongside one of the biggest EV automakers, one of the biggest healthcare companies, one of the biggest consumer product companies. It's the result of 2 years of joint investment by climate scientists and AI engineers. And you can basically feed into it a description of any product. You could write it, you could bring in a bill of materials, and it constructs the entire production process and supply chain for that product, measures the emissions of that process, and tells you exactly where the emissions are. And you can tweak it and say, actually, no, I have this supplier. I am procuring this from Vietnam, not from India. And it updates, and it takes what used to be a 6-month project for one product and makes it a afternoon project for as many products as you want. And it works whether you're building airplanes or you're building tennis shoes.
That's awesome.
And we think it could be really big. And so we are investing a ton in making that promise real for the customers we work with. But if we get it right, it means that a procurement team or product design team, at the moment they're making a decision, at the moment they're designing a product, can know the trade-offs, can make the right decisions, and can see that feedback loop immediately. And it's literally something that would not have been possible 12 months ago. But the evolution of AI models paired with a lot of domain expertise and data that we've spent 6 years developing enables something that we didn't think we could have dreamed of. And now our sights are a lot higher on what's possible.
That brings me to a compliment Cliff gave, my husband Cliff, gave you, which was he was saying you're not just applying off the shelf AI. What you guys really are building is tools powered by proprietary missions data across global supply chains, which means that your data set compared to just generic AI models is significantly better. Talk a little bit about that advantage.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm a big believer in general that domain specificity matters a lot on AI applications for big companies.
Yep.
And so
Great.
I think you see that across a lot of different domains. The way we see that is, this product is a great example, which is we have trained a whole bunch of agents that are really good at knowing what production processes go into a different given product and what are the emissions of each of those processes. And there's a ton of science depth. There's a ton of peer-reviewed work. There's a lot of data from, Watershed's customer base is responsible for 5% of the world's carbon emissions. And so that informs the insights that we're able to bring to bear on the decisions that companies make.
Knowing we have a few minutes left, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions quickly to just get quick answers. When you zoom all the way out, what's the clearest signal that you're watching that tells you that you are on track towards that huge, audacious goal that you started with?
Well, I'll be honest, I feel we've got a lot more to do. And I feel like the sense I have when I think about that goal is a goal of inflection, acceleration. We've got the potential energy, right? We've got this huge, this privilege of getting to work with companies responsible for 5% of the world's carbon emissions. That's potential energy. We've got to turn that kinetic and real reductions, real action. So the thing I'm looking at is how many solar panels are in the ground that wouldn't be there without us? How many battery deployments are there that wouldn't be without our customers? How many, um, preserved forests because companies are sourcing crops without deforestation are there as a result of the companies that we work with taking smart action?
You working in climate means you're working thinking decades out. Um, and to your point, you said like some of the best things that you've seen from some of your investors are this just long-term thinking, very intentional thinking. Do you have any hack or anything that you've kind of trained yourself, Taylor, to just stay grounded in that thinking when you're faced with like potentially just hard decisions?
I mean, I think it's the keep the main thing, and
Keep your eye on the prize.
keep your eyes on the prize. And for us, that is like mission, customer, team. And so mission is how does this add up to 500 megatons? Customer is you cannot evade, or you cannot replace, there's nothing more valuable than a happy customer. And everything needs to build towards that. And then team is you've got to be a really special place for great people to do great work to pull that off.
I love that. Taylor, I'm going to transition to just questions. You tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. Um, what is a habit you've adopted in this role that has helped you stay on the treadmill?
Hmm. I don't know that it's about this role, but my favorite habit is get a 5-year journal where you've got 4 lines per day, and every page shows the same day over the last 5 years. And at the end of every day, you write 4 lines. It doesn't need to be groundbreaking. What did you do? How did you feel? What did you think? And 2 big moments of payoff. One is at that moment, you feel a bit of reflection on, okay, I got something done today. And then you get to see where were you a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago on that day. And it just makes you feel like you're making progress. They're $40 on Amazon.
I need the journal.
I'm on my second one. They're fantastic.
By the way, you have to send me this link. I cannot
We'll
wait.
put it in the show notes.
I know we literally, it'll be linked to it.
Yeah.
What is the book that you've read that changed your life? Just any book that you strongly recommend. Doesn't have to be a business book.
Just Kids, Patti Smith.
Love it. A mantra that just kind of runs in your head. Any mantra, that's something meaningful to you.
My mom's mom would say over and over again, why not? Why not? Why not? What's the worst that could happen? And she was blind when she was old. And so we actually, everyone in my family has a keychain that says why not in Braille on it. And I feel like that's the appropriate response to a lot of questions.
I just got chills. That's incredible. Last two questions. If you think of the biggest pinch me moment that you've had to date since building Watershed, what was it? What was the day you went home from work and just kind of felt like, wow, what happened?
First all company offsite, it was Bodega Bay. There were maybe 40 people at the company, and just it's an insane privilege for so many smart people to trust their time and their brilliance into this thing we're doing.
That is a pinch me moment. And I want to end on what is one thing that everyone listening can do, one new habit to help our environment and our climate? What's one thing that's simple that we should all be doing?
Most important thing is to make sure that you're getting your electricity from renewable sources. And there's a lot of ways to do that. It doesn't require putting a solar panel on your roof. Most utilities have green power programs. They work. That's the biggest lever on decarbonizing the economy.
Everybody, if you're listening, opt into your clean climate, clean energy. Taylor, it has been a pleasure getting to know you. I'm clearly rooting for you, heart, soul, and mind. And we just wish you the biggest luck. And thank you so much for letting us just listen. Everybody out there, if your company is not already using Watershed, if they should be, write in to the appropriate people. Make sure Watershed is on their radar. And just Taylor, Godspeed. Truly.
Thank you so much. This was a joy.
Thank you all so much for tuning in today. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate, review, subscribe. We'll be back again with another episode of Inspired with Alexa Von Tobel. Thank you.